In this demo, I'm going to show you how to make a chart of the tints, tones, and shades of the primary colors in your palette. In the PowerPoint presentation, we went over the color wheel, color temperature, color schemes, and tints, tones, and shades. Our first exercise will be to make a color wheel of primary and secondary colors, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, pretty straightforward, so I don't feel I want to do a demo on that. However, the second exercise is a little more involved, and the third one even more so. And that's optional, but I highly recommend doing that, and you'll see that in the PowerPoint presentation. Before I begin, I want to show you this color wheel, which you can buy at an art supply store or online. It's very nice. It's kind of like a pinwheel, and you can actually determine the different tints, tones, and shades of colors and color mixes, and on the back it has color schemes. It's a useful tool to have. Okay. So to begin our chart of the different tints, tones, and shades of our primary colors, the primary colors in our palette, I laid out my colors on a palette. I wanted to talk about that quickly. This is palette paper. You can use a regular wooden palette, but I tend to use palette paper. It works for me. And I've laid out my colors along the periphery of the palette. I think palette organization is something that is important, but it's also something that is personal. It depends on what you're painting. For example, if you're painting landscape, you're going to have a different palette than if you're painting the figure or still life. So it really depends on what you're painting. But in general, organizing your palette, there are a few things that make it easier, and you should just keep it consistent so you don't even have to think about it. Laying out the colors along one periphery, and for me, I like to lay out the earth tones. If I had earth tones here, I'm not going to use them in this case. We're not going to mix a chromatic black using an earth tone. We're going to just use ivory black straight out of the tube for our exercises. I would lay out the earth tones in a certain area away from the colors, and then I would have my black and whites and grays in this case along another edge of the palette, trying to leave as much open area within the palette so you can make your mixes. I tend to lay things out in this yellow, red, blue sequence, and I also lay out the cool color first and then the warm color. So we have the lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, quinacridone red, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and phthalo blue. So cool, warm, cool, warm, cool, warm. Okay, and that's the way I always do it when I'm painting. The chart is a little bit different. It just reverses the order in terms of or changes the order a little bit. So let's begin. First thing you need to do is create the chart, which is very simple. 1-inch squares, 4 across and 6 down. So 4 columns, 6 rows, so it's 4 by 6. The top row is going to be your cadmium red, CR, quinacridone red for the second row, cadmium yellow, lemon yellow, phthalo blue, the warm blue, and finally ultramarine blue, which is a cool blue. Hue or color will be the first column. The tint, adding 50% white to the hue, will be the second column. The tone, adding 50% gray, which has to be pre-mixed. And this is a 50-50 mix of black and white, so equal parts black and white to create your gray. And you need enough of it to finish that column. And then finally the shade, which is a color that has black added to it. Now we're going to work with equal measures, 50-50 roughly, of one to the other. That doesn't mean that a tone can't be 25% gray and 75% color. You can vary that. You don't always have to measure it. It really depends on what you're looking for in your painting. But here, because we're creating an exercise, we want a certain consistency. throughout, we're going to stick to a 50-50 mix when we do begin to mix our tints, tones, and shades. The first thing we do, and I'm using acrylic just for convenience, easy cleanup and it dries quickly, but you can do this with oils or acrylic. Well, actually, the first thing I'm going to do is just put the color down, and I'm not going to do the whole thing in this video, but I will finish it, and then I can post it on the presentation, the demo, and the PowerPoint presentation. So, our warm red. You can see the difference between these reds. I'll just take a little bit of that cadmium red. I'm using a flat brush. It's more of a bright, actually, short bristles. And just filling in that section as carefully as possible. You need a little bit of water or paint thinner to help the paint flow, that's fine, but as in the value scale, we would like to try it and keep our colors as opaque as possible, because if the white of the paper shows through, that is just like adding white to the color. It creates a little bit of a tint without really wanting to create that. Okay, so now we have our first section blocked in. And you can work any way you want. I've seen students create the rows first, the colors, then the tints, then the tones, and others work their way across. I'll just work my way across. So now I'm going to add, you don't need a ton of paint. And remember, we kind of estimate using a small amount of paint, a palette knife. Try to get the right mix in there. A little more white, maybe. And you'll get a pink. Out of this, obviously, it's a tint. It's a red tint. And when you mixed it so that it's consistent, you can also mix a bit with your brush. Fill in the square. I created my chart using a Sharpie marker, just so you could see better. You can just use pencil. The Sharpie will bleed through the acrylic eventually if I were to try to cover it. If you're using oils, the oils will cover the marker. Okay, so there we have a tint, cadmium red tint. And now I'm going to create a cadmium red tone. I'm cleaning my palette knife and the brush each time. And you need to take the pure paint and mix it with the gray and with the black and with the white. Don't mix the tint with gray. This is a beautiful color. Some of these colors, you're going to be amazed at how beautiful they are. And they change. Sometimes color characteristics change. The purpose of this, as I wrote in the presentation, is to show you these value changes, how colors change in terms of their values, and also the temperature of the different colors. Sometimes these things are a little harder to see until you add something like white to a color to bring out its undertones and its temperature. When I use the term undertones, and we'll talk more about that, I'm referring to colors such as blue, for example. Ultramarine blue is a cool blue and it has a violet undertone. The phthalo blue is a warm blue, it has more of a green undertone. And these are things to consider when you're mixing colors. And I'll talk a little more about that in the presentation. The last thing I need to do is mix equal amounts of black with the pure red, and we'll be done with that row. So this doesn't take long. I think for this session, if we can create a color wheel, this chart, and begin working or even finish working on the third exercise, which is a secondary color chart with tints, tones, and shades. We'll be in good shape. And these are not just exercises that you make and then get rid of. These actually are meant to be reference charts that you can put up in your studio, on the studio wall, and it helps you determine color mixes based on what you're looking at, the objects that you're looking at. This brush probably already has enough water that I don't need to dip it in there. So let's, try and keep things nice and neat as much as possible. This brush is a little big, 3/4 inch brush, 1 inch square, so I'm trying to be careful. And I have a row completed. Cadmium red, tint, tone, and shade. Isn't that nice? Very nice. Okay, the next color I'm going to do is the cool red, quinacridone red, and then we'll end our video there after I finish that row. And I'll just keep doing this chart and then post it on the presentation and at the end of this video, so you have a good reference. So, quinacridone red, straight out of the tube. This red, as you can see, is semi-transparent. Some colors are more opaque than others, and it doesn't help that this brush has a little bit of water in it, in the bristles, but let's just go for it. And you can see the difference right away. So undertones, this red has a violet undertone. It's a cool red compared to the warm cadmium red above it, which has more of an orange. Will have more of an orange undertone. Nice. Okay, the next step is tint. Equal parts white and quinacridone red. It's hard to say that word, quinacridone. You can see the difference probably right on the palette between these two colors. And this is a very nice color, kind of like a hot pink compared to this. It's kind of like a rose color. Big difference there. So hues are, again, hue is a kind of a term that can be used in the same way that it's color can, but there is a difference. Like, these are colors that I'm working with. Quinacridone red is a color, cadmium red is a color, but the hue is red. They're versions of red. So the colors are versions of the red hue. So there's a slight difference there. Now we need to produce the tone, equal parts gray and quinacridone red. An amazing color. Now these colors have their own values also. Yellow, as you can see, is a light value compared to red. Red is kind of an intermediate value compared to the blue. So the colors themselves out of the tube have their own values. And that should be reflected in this chart as you work your way down and across. So these tones, these red tones are very similar in value. There should be consistency from one value to the others as far as the color, the originating color, the yellow tint, tone, and shade should be lighter than the reds, and the blues should be darker than all of them. All right, the last thing we're going to do before we sign off here is create the shade. And I need black. And again, just use the ivory black in your palette. You don't have to mess around with creating a chromatic black like we did before. This just makes it easier. And then create your shade. And we're almost done. One more square. This one, I think it's either the water, the amount of water on the brush, or it's just the transparency of the quinacridone red. Trying to get rid of as much white as possible. All right, finished. There we have a chart. The beginnings of your second exercise. The first exercise is the color wheel, primaries and secondaries. Second exercise is a chart showing the tints, tones, and shades and temperatures of the colors within your palette. This is, remember, a limited palette using primaries, cool and warm versions of each. And from these you can mix anything you want. And I'll continue and then post this on at the end of the video and on the presentation. Okay, done.